purposes, thus dealing with the problem of not wanting to finance the government and with the humanitarian issue. In terms of establishing a humanitarian corridor, yes, that's another thing that one can imagine happening. That's another possible use of military assets to establish a humanitarian corridor such as happened in the Balkans and such as was contemplated at one point in Sudan. That, of course, does not in any way impinge upon Gaddafi's ability to make war. It simply begins to address the humanitarian problem.
James Traub, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Well, in Washington, a senior U.S. senator has warned that U.S. ground troops in Libya would be, quote, counterproductive. But John Kerry, who chairs the U.S. Senate's Foreign Relations Committee, also said the international community should begin preparations for a no-fly zone in the event of a massacre of civilians by the Libyan Air Force. During an interview on U.S. television, Kerry also said $30 billion of Gaddafi's assets had been frozen and would be made available to the opposition for, quote, a new Libya. He didn't set any time frame for that to happen, though, and Al Jazeera has been trying to seek clarification from the State Department, but it simply referred us to Senator Kerry's office, which wouldn't comment further. Kerry said it's in the American national interest, meanwhile, for Gaddafi to step down because of the, quote, mischief he threatens in the future, and that America was making its presence felt in the region by offering humanitarian assistance. For more, let's speak to Al Jazeera's John Tarrant. Again, tell us more about what Kerry has been discussing.
Well, Shihab, John Kerry is a very senior American politician. Our viewers may well remember that he tried to win the White House in 2004 against President George W. Bush and lost. But since that time, he has, particularly since the Arab uprisings have begun, become a kind of senior spokesperson in Washington for the Obama administration when they feel there are things that need to be said that they can't actually say. For example, you may remember that on the tipping point in the Egyptian revolution, just before Hosni Mubarak stood down, it was John Kerry who wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times and used the bully pulpit of his chairmanship of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to call for President Mubarak to step down, and he did a couple of days later. The White House felt it couldn't say those words at the time. And so today now, John Kerry, on a major national television program, is saying that a no-fly zone over Libya can be implemented without a step over the line into unwanted military intervention. And this, of course, brings him into direct contradiction with the Defense Secretary, Robert Gates, who only last week was saying pretty much the exact opposite. Here's more of how Mr. Kerry put it this morning on a major American news program.
One, prepare a no-fly zone in conjunction with our allies, not implement it. Certainly, first hope would be, if it were called on, to be done only in the context of international agreement and sanction. But right now, they don't want that, and I think that's good. The last thing we want to think about is any kind of military intervention, and I don't consider the fly zone stepping over that line. We don't want troops on the ground. They don't want troops on the ground. That would be counterproductive.
Interestingly, though, administration officials also on the Sunday talk show program suggesting a no-fly zone does cross that line that Kerry cited.
Well, that's right. We've had slightly mixed signals today. We also heard from John McCain, who is a very senior Republican senator from Arizona, and he repeated his call made last week for a no-fly zone to be put into place, saying that we can't risk that Colonel Gaddafi might try to massacre his civilian population, and calling the fact that he is calling for a no-fly zone a test for President Obama of whether he, the president, really wants to see Gaddafi go or not. But Bill Daley, who is the new White House Chief of Staff, speaking on a similar program today, said that he was very confident that the United States and its allies would be able to work together and coordinate a global response over Libya. However, he did make it very clear that the president fully understands that that will have to be in conjunction with the international community. And I think, Shihab, that we are in a situation where the White House has a little bit of luxury on its side. There isn't a single country in the world which is fighting against America's stance on Libya. And so I think, in a way, they're waiting really for the rest of the world to fall into line and to decide that they do want to have some kind of no-fly zone. That hasn't happened yet, of course, as you know.
John Tarrant, thank you very much. That's all from Washington. More from the Americas later in the news hour, but now let's go back to Doha.
Protesters in Egypt say they've been attacked by security services and armed men in plain clothes. The unrest started when the demonstrators tried to storm a government building to seize sensitive papers linked to the Mubarak regime. Ayman Mohyuddin has more from Cairo.
Outside the towering Ministry of Interior, they gathered, demanding access. But on Sunday evening, as the crowds grew, so too did the tension. The Egyptian military, under strict orders to prevent crowds from storming the sprawling security complex, fired warning shots into the air. The situation further complicated with the arrival of armed men, who the protesters described as former regime loyalists that tried to attack the crowds. Earlier on Sunday, the prosecutor general had ordered all state security buildings sealed. That decision came after protesters stormed the operational headquarters of the state security in another Cairo suburb. There, they found documents, police records, underground rooms, and even a passageway that led to a secret living quarter they claimed was used by the powerful Minister of Interior, now standing trial. They also found bags of shredded documents. With the recent departure of the Mubarak-appointed Prime Minister Ahmed Shafiq, protesters feared that state security officials would attempt to destroy all evidence that would implicate them. After protesters stormed this massive state security compound behind me, Egypt's new prime minister asked anyone with incriminating evidence or documents to hand them over to the military so that they can be used in the prosecution of former regime officials. Documents like these, obtained by Isra Abdel Fattah, who was detained by state security twice for her political activism, show how state security was spying on her, even hacking into her email accounts to find out which organizations she was involved in and who she was in regular contact with.
These records show they were extremely paranoid from us. Every piece of information that for us seemed insignificant would be significant for them. They were convinced that there must have been some international organization behind my activities.
That sense of paranoia led state security to act with impunity for years, many say. State security was often accused of corruption, extortion, and torturing activists and citizens alike. Hussam Hamallawi was tortured while in the custody of state security.
State security has to be dissolved completely, not restructured or frozen, but to be dissolved. Secondly, every single officer and corporal and agent and informer in that agency must be put on trial.
Today, on the walls of the abandoned complex that came to symbolize the oppression Egyptians endured under the previous regime, a simple message left by the protesters. This is the fate of the oppressors. Ayman Mohyuddin, AlJazeera, Nasser City.
An Egyptian cabinet reshuffle announced on Sunday will see 3 new faces in key posts. The Prime Minister's office says it has appointed Nabil Al-Arabi as the country's new foreign minister. He's a former judge at the International Court of Justice and was a permanent